Okay, this video is for notes 3. And before you are ready to take notes, make sure you have your notebook and it is all set up with the 4 images. Now remember, if you want to take notes like this left side, over here, you're going to have a lot to write in a small little area. So make sure you're writing small, succinct, and really neat and clear. Now, if you want to take notes with a little more space, you know yourself and know your handwriting, over here, then you've got plenty of space and you shouldn't need to worry about that. And either one is fine. It's whatever you want to do based on your notebook and how you learn best. So before we get started, make sure you have the 4 titles written down. So title for image 1, title for image 2, image 3, and image 4. We will have a summary as well. You can write that at the end of image 4 or just wait till we do it at the end. Remember, you can pause this video whenever you need to. So when I go too fast through a slide, pause it. You can rewatch whatever you need to. Just rewind. So 2 note-taking goals for today. One is writing very neatly, keeping your organization clean. And the other one is summarizing in your own words. So I'm going to have definitions on the video and on the PowerPoint here that sometimes are long and sometimes are repeated. And you don't need the whole thing. So think about what you need and think about what makes sense for you. So energy in an ecosystem is like money. It's currency that gets passed back and forth together between these 4 different components. So next to image 1, you want to have the title of this section, ecosystems of 4 components linked by a flow of energy. And these are the 4 components. Primary producers, these are plants. They make their own energy. Consumers, these things consume energy. Decomposers, they also consume energy in a different way. And abiotic factors, non-living. Now think to yourself, do you know this already? If you already are thinking non-living when you hear abiotic, then you don't need to add it. If, however, you hear abiotic and you don't remember what it is, then add non-living. So pause the video if you need a second to write those 4 down. Let's think here, what is gonna go where? And so before I just give you the answer, think about what of these 4 is sort of the beginning of the story. Now the sun is really the ultimate source. So think what receives, that's what we see by this blue arrow, what receives or consumes energy from the sun. Then where does that thing go? Where does that go? And then what can kind of be on the outside that's not technically giving or receiving direct energy transfer, so isn't involved in the blue lines, but is related and helps all the processes happen. So then take a second to check and see what you got there. So the sun is the source. Then we have producers, our leaves and our trees and our plants. We have consumers. This would be us. We have decomposers. This would be fungi or mushrooms, bacteria. We can have scavengers in here. And even some animals can do some decomposing or will consume things that might be created or might be thought of as waste. And then the abiotic is what's kind of circling and affects all of these things, affects the others, but is not quite directly involved in an energy transfer process. So that is image 1, thinking about kind of a broad picture of the 4 components. The rest of the images really are cutting out a little bit the abiotic factors and talking in a lot more detail about those blue arrows and the 3 different categories of producers, consumers, and decomposers. So if we think about image 2 from our data lab, we can label these levels with different levels of producer and consumer. Primary producers is the vocabulary that begins any sort of ecological pyramid or food web or food chain. Sometimes when you see the word primary, you'll just see a 1 with a little 0. It's just saying primary. That's producers. Then we step up. Now we have things that are consuming energy. So we have the same level, primary, or same symbol, not different levels, same symbol, primary, secondary, tertiary. These, however, are consumers. So it's a primary consumer. It's a secondary consumer if they consume primary consumers, and many times plants. It's a tertiary or third level consumer if they consume secondary consumers, and sometimes primary consumers, and even sometimes plants. So off to the left, the description or the area that you have in your notes that goes with this image, where an organism gets its energy. We're going to talk about autotrophs, heterotrophs, and decomposers. These all get their energy in different ways. So take a second to, especially if you're working in a small space, make sure each of these gets their own line, and make sure that it's clear and organized. Pause the video if you need to. Now let's look at the definitions. These definitions are long. You don't need to write this whole thing. Let's practice summarizing in our own words. Autotrophs capture energy from environment to make their own food. I would just write make their own food. Then I would write examples. Example, plants. Other things though, like protists and bacteria, these are both single-celled things. Very simple living things can also do this, which is pretty cool. Some of the bright colors that you see in the pools of Yellowstone are actually bacteria that are doing photosynthesis, which is pretty cool, or being an autotroph and making their own food. So that's autotrophs. Heterotrophs cannot manufacture their own food, so they get energy by eating or consuming other organisms. As we saw in our data lab, there are different vocabulary words to talk about what they eat. Herbivores eat producers, which we know, and it's another way of saying plants, like deer. Omnivores eat other consumers and producers. And carnivores eat other consumers, or you might say eat meat. Now think to yourself, do you already know those words? When I say herbivore, do you already think about a deer that eats plants? If you do, then just feel free to write the vocabulary down and don't define it. But if you're not sure what that means, or if it wasn't going to come to the top of your head, then you should write that down. Pause the video to take a second to write down as you need. Lastly, decomposers. And these guys are also a type of heterotroph because they obtain energy from feeding. They just feed on the garbage or waste of an ecosystem. This can be animals that have died. It could be fallen leaves or dead plants. It could be actual animal waste like poop. Other organisms can use it. And another thing to think about and definitely add is they break down and recycle. This word recycle is important. They recycle nutrients in the ecosystem. Now, if you think about examples, mushroom and fungi, many insects like potato or pill bugs, worms, but also other scavengers like these vultures can be thought of as decomposers, feeding on the garbage or waste. Pause as you need to write down and think about those different vocabulary words. So now take a second to connect how things are getting energy with where they fit in the pyramid. So autotrophs are plants at the bottom. Where do the other ones match? So heterotrophs are going to be all these other ones. Herbivores will be that first level. Omnivores often second. Carnivores up on top. Now, if we think decomposers are not actually in here. So the next model that we're going to look at, trophic structure, is a much more comprehensive view of what's going on with decomposers and with energy and amounts. So let's dive into that third model. So here we are looking at this image, this blue ecological, or aka trophic energy pyramid. This is the most complex of the models and the one that tells us the most information. So in many ways, it's the best. So you can see the vocabulary that we had before of primary producers up through different levels of consumers to an apex predator. You can also see in red the percents of energy that are available. And there's some other aspects that are important too that we'll reference and come back to at the end. So underneath this section, let me show you what you'll have. So we're going to have two different things here. One is about narrowing at the top. So pause the video to take a second to write out these titles. What narrows at the top? Because as you move up levels, you decrease. We'll talk about three different things. And also we're going to talk about the percent of energy that is lost between each level and why it's lost to two different reasons. So we will have a little more to write about on this image. So why does it narrow at the top? Well, there are three main reasons. One is organisms get less efficient, so their productivity is decreasing. Now remember, all of these things, as we go up in the levels, we decrease. So they are less efficient, and there's more waste. Those apex predators are much less efficient than an herbivore. Productivity of organisms. This can also be thought of as how well organisms convert energy in the food they eat to biomass, or atoms and molecules on their body. Number two is available energy to them. As you go up in level, you're decreasing available energy. And number three is number of organisms. We've been looking at this in class, or population size. There's a lot more deer and a lot more plants in an ecosystem than there are wolves and bears and predators. So that is why we're narrowing at the top. Now let's talk a little bit more about this idea of energy lost. So if we look at your original image, we can see that here we have 100. Here we have 10. Between that, 90% is lost. And so let's add some notes to this image here. 90% lost. And then from 10 to 1, we have 9, but that's also like saying 90%, because 9 is 90% of 10. And then for every level transition, that's how much energy is lost. Now, a big part of where that's going is it's getting lost as heat. That's another form of energy, right? I eat my meal and then my body is heating up my body, but it's not necessarily going to making me larger. Not all of what I eat, at least. So we can say that 90% is lost, and we could also say 10% is kept. So 90% of energy is lost between each level. And why exactly? Well, the first part is an organism living. This is where that heat is coming from, but it's also going to just growing, respiration or breathing, reproduction, basically an animal living. The second thing that loses is waste. Some of that energy goes to being wasted. So plants and animals are not eaten by organisms at the next trophic level above them. They die, become waste, consumed by decomposers. So those are the two things. Now, I might write this and I might write that with a little example or a brief description. I wouldn't write that entire definition. Just think about what the main idea there is. So going back to the image, let's add one more thing here. We haven't really talked about where those decomposers are. So part of it's lost to energy as heat, part of it's lost to decomposers. But then the decomposers goes back into the energy pyramid through recycled nutrients in the soil. Then plants are taking those recycled nutrients and the ultimate source of energy for all ecosystems, or the sun, and they are moving that energy up. So why are there no 5th or 6th level consumers? Well, there's not a lot of available energy. Look at that. 10. J is the unit of joules or energy. And so if there's not a lot available, those organisms can't survive. That's why we don't see these mega predators, things that eat lions or whales or things like that. So last image here is just looking at 3 different ways that we look at energy flow in models. One's a food chain. This is just a one path. One is a web. That's what we're going to be looking at over the next few days. It's all of the food chains interrelated. Gets messy, but it's real. And last is the trophic pyramid, focus holes. So that is it for notes.